classroom has questions. But I'll just jump right in. So basically, I'm going to talk a bit about branding yourself as a developer. I'm not sure the background of the programs that you guys are at. I think, if I'm not mistaken, it's the Gainesville Academy?
Dev Academy, yes.
Okay, cool. And it's a night program. You guys
Yes.
your curriculum, etc.
Correct.
Cool. So I imagine mostly career changers are people who are still in school trying to make it into their first job. Is that correct?
Some, yes.
Okay, cool.
Not all, yes.
Awesome. So that's basically what I'm getting at. Is just basically my assumption is most people either don't have their first programming job and want to get one, and that's basically the assumption that this talk is going to go to. So essentially, my questions up front was just trying to figure out, so you're learning how to code, and the question is, how do you stand out? A lot of the problem is a lot of people come from either the university background or they come from these coding boot camps, and a lot of the coding boot camps and the university, they teach the same thing. But it doesn't really give you much of an opportunity to really stand out from everybody else that's applying to the same company. I actually saw a blog post this morning, which I apologize, I didn't actually have the link to provide since I just read it this morning, but I saw that most tech companies get about 250 applications per rec out there. So there's a range from startups to mid-sized companies. And from that, all those 250 applications, they get filtered down to 2%. So only 2% of those 250 actual applications, regardless of qualifications, they ended up getting filtered based on whatever stands out in their resume. And a lot of this talks actually be focused on how do you become that 2%. So when you learn how to code, it seems like when you first learning how to code, it's all downhill. It's actually all uphill. But once you get to the point where you learn how to code, so majority of you, the assumption is you get to the point where you're either at the end of the program, end of your semester, looking for an internship or your first job. Once you have the coding under your background, it gets a lot easier. And this talks, it's about branding yourself as a developer. So I'm going to talk about three things. One is choosing your lane. It's going to be the first part. Number two is going to be making friends. And then the third thing is actually be packaging your experience with examples, which I'll talk about in more detail later on. But like I said before, the goal is really to get hired for your first developing job. So one thing that I noticed when I first started getting the code, and I've been coding about yes.
Yes, I sure can.
Oh, looks like we have some.
Okay, I lost your sound on the other one. Hold on. How about now? Keep talking. I'll turn this other thing off.
Okay. Cool. So I'm not sure if I'm talking to future Duncan or present Duncan right now, but I'll assume I'm talking to present Duncan. So what I was getting at is that Googling your name. So I'm just going to do something very simple, and I recommend everybody in the class who's watching do the same thing. If you have your phone out, go ahead and Google your name and see what pops up. And this is, as far as getting to that 2%, this is one of the first things you're going to do if you're a hiring manager at a tech company and you're looking just to get the most qualified people in front of the hiring managers. So these are managers for getting people actually in the team. So I Googled my name, and this is actually not fair because I'm logged into my Google account. So Google already knows who I am and kind of what people are probably going to be looking for. So they've definitely found my Twitter. They found my avatar. That's fine. I'm not going to do it in private browsing, but if your name doesn't pop up and you're logged in as yourself, then that's a big red flag of maybe you might want to add something that to point yourself as like a promising developer. So I highly recommend that. One of the other things that I like to mention too when I give this talk is Brian Douglas Wells. It used to be the #1 search for Brian Douglas. If you guys aren't familiar with this guy, not a lot of people are. There was a movie called 30 Seconds or Less with Jesse Eisenberg, who was a guy in the Social Network, that Facebook movie. It was about a pizza delivery guy who got a bomb strapped against him, and he had to rob banks with this bomb. So he basically he didn't really have a choice, but he ended up getting arrested. And actually, I think he actually didn't even live through it. Anyway, it's a real sad story, but they made a movie about it, and that was the top hit for Brian Douglas at the time when I first got into coding. So I realized that if I wanted people to know who I was, I needed to actually build my own brand first. So just a small little exercise for you guys to try out and check out and to see what these hiring managers are actually seeing when they actually Google your name. It's a note about that. So me, just a little bit about myself. I'm Brian Douglas. I actually develop at a company called Netlify. I'm actually based here in San Francisco Bay Area. Live in Oakland, but work in San Francisco. Netlify is a young company. We're about 11 people now, and I think actually maybe 12 as of yesterday. And we're still a growing company. So there's a lot of opportunity for me to grow and a lot of opportunity for me to build a brand, which is part of the reason why I work at Netlify. I'll get into more details about Netlify in a sec. And then I just wanted to point out everything that you're doing now, keep doing, because everything I'm talking about won't work unless you actually know how to code. So if you haven't got the basics out of the way of programming, it's obviously when you get to an interview, you're not going to be able to actually stand up to the interview challenge if you don't know the basics. So make sure you do the basics first. All this is just extra. Cool. So first, going to start with choosing your lane. I started coding about 2013. I don't have an actual CS degree. Actually, coincidentally, started coding in Tampa. I'm actually from the Tampa Bay area, just south of you guys. So pretty much raised in Florida in the Tampa Bay area. And I got a finance degree back in the worst time you could get a finance degree, which was 2008 is when I graduated. And I ended up just taking a job in the sales, did sales for a while, got promoted rather quickly. And in less than a year, got promoted 3 times. So I was doing pretty well for myself, but I found that my next step wasn't going to be anywhere I wanted to be. It was either field sales or management. And at the time I was selling stuff that didn't really care about. I was selling IT equipment. So I actually sold a product twice in the entire 2.5 years that I worked for the company. And it wasn't really that, other than getting a nice paycheck, it wasn't really that rewarding. So I made the jump into teaching myself how to code. And that was back in 2013. And when I made that decision, I actually started a blog on Google Blogspot, which is probably the worst place you could probably start a blog. It's pretty awful UI. It's pretty out of date. I don't recommend starting a blog on Google Blogspot today. There's so many other options. And I'll mention a couple options later. But my whole decision was to write down my story as it was happening. And this is before I even decided that I was going to get a job in an X amount of time. I just decided I was going to learn the code and started this blog and started writing down my journey. And about 29 weeks later, I ended up getting my first coding job. And I'll get into that a little bit later. But I just was really determined. About a year prior, actually started doing Android development. And I say I started doing Android development. I didn't actually develop anything. I completed a YouTube video that built a very simplistic Android app that I could use on my phone. It was pretty contrived. It didn't really have much to share. And from there, I got a Java book thinking I was going to be a programmer. And I never actually followed through. So part of the reason for me to start a blog was to convince myself to follow through with this the second time around. And then out of that, I also started learning Ruby as my first language. You could basically learn any language. There's no real, I think all languages are great. But you definitely want to just pick one at first if you want to focus and pick your lane. So my lane was Ruby at the time. At the moment, I write about 7 to 8 different languages and do probably 3 times as many of those frameworks and those languages. So I'm not really specific to Ruby now. But for me to getting started, it was real easy for me to build a brand based on that community and that language. And from there, I started a community where I was able to meet with other people online like we're doing now. And on two nights a week, I would go through different Ruby curriculums and books, and I would meet with about 10 to 15 other aspiring Ruby developers, and we talk about some of the basics. And because of this, I was able to build even more of a brand of just beginning Ruby. So my blog posts actually were based around learning Ruby for the first time, and I was able to kind of build a brand around being a Ruby newbie is what the term was. And that actually, I think the site's actually still up. I actually passed on the site to somebody else, another Ruby newbieist. I think it's at rubynewbies.org. And there I was able to, again, build my brand even further. So that's just a little bit about my lane. I'm out now at Netlify. And Netlify, I just want to spend 2 slides talking about this. Netlify is a Git-centric workflow to host front-end focused websites. actually Netlify is a platform that integrates and automates all services needing to deploy modern websites. So that's the actual marketing speak there. It just means three things. It's get integrated. So you either host on GitHub, Bitbucket, GitLab, one of those other Git providers. You use JavaScript to actually build your site. And then you also have build tools like Webpack, Gulp, Browserify, etc. Funny thing is that Webpack actually, it builds about 83% of the web. So if you wanted to find your lane, I think Webpack's actually a good place to start learning. So if you're into front-end websites, definitely take a chance with Webpack. And then in addition, also there's APIs. So third-party APIs like Discourse, Google Analytics would be count as a third-party API. And then things like Auth0 for authentication, or even if you wanted to do Facebook login, if you happen to build a website like that. So anything that uses third-party web APIs and not actual local servers. And all these bullet points could all be summarized into this term we're trying to push, which is called Jamstack. Everything from the above can be summarized to be a Jamstack site. So check out jamstack.org if you want to find out more details. I also host a podcast called Jamstack Radio, which goes in more details and use cases on what Jamstack is. Cool. And then there's one thing that I just wanted to mention too. One more thing about Netlify is that we're putting out this Netlify CMS. So I'm in the opinion that similar to using Google Blogspot to build your brand and find your lane, Netlify actually builds a CMS, which is very similar to like WordPress. The only thing is it's not, doesn't need a huge host. WordPress can get a little expensive. It actually can get pretty massive once you start walking around with the server that's associated with it. Netlify is nice because all you need is a GitHub portfolio or a GitHub profile rather, and to host your front-end blog, and you can actually connect to your Netlify CMS with it. This is some early stage mockups and UI as far as the logo. As of tonight, maybe in a few hours, we're actually going to be unveiling netlifycms.com. So maybe if you check back tomorrow morning, since you guys are East Coast, we might not get it out before your night, but we're actually pushing this site live. So you can actually check out netlifycms.com tomorrow morning to find out more details about it. And just want to move on real quick to, so this is actually my blog. This is like the home of most of my content. At the moment, I blog a bit about React and a little bit about Go. And this is me continuing to build my brand. And the nice thing about Netlify CMS, if I just go to /admin to my live website, I can actually log in through GitHub. And it gives me access to be able to write actual blog posts without the need of actually getting down in the code. So it takes away that abstraction of constantly committing and pushing stuff to GitHub. So if I wanted to create a post and create a new post and add some tags to it, my backend is actually Middleman. So Middleman's actually a Ruby static site generator. And I could actually write a post and save it. And then from there, it opens up a pull request onto my GitHub portfolio. So if you guys aren't familiar yet, this is another sample post I have. But if you're not familiar yet, there's a term called static site generators. I highly recommend checking them out. Go to I blog on GitHub, and I can see there's a pull request waiting for me that I just created, which has my new posts all written in Markdown. So this is another benefit. Is actually a lot of people are moving towards static site generators for making blogs. Highly recommend doing that because it doesn't take as much work getting it up and running. Part of the reason why I went with Blogspot to actually write my blog was because I didn't want to spend more time building the blog than I was actual writing content for the blog. The analogy I use is when people are in high school and they want to start a band, they spend more time actually building their cover art and rather than actually writing music. And that's most programmers tend to create a blog but never actually write anything on a blog. So and it's pretty much the norm, which is why it's pretty easy to build your brand around your blog because no one else is really doing it very consistently. So that's almost the meat of what I'm talking about choosing your lane. Finding out what's actually going to be what you're going to stand. First find out what type of thing, whether it's a language or a framework or this cool thing you learned how to do. what's going to make you stand out from the crowd. So you just want to be part of that 2% when people are looking through your applications. So number 2, make friends. So I assume most people in the room probably are using GitHub to host their code. If they're not, they're using something similar. I think Git has really taken over the programming community as far as hosting version control and stuff like that. And I think GitHub is really leading the market when hosting Git focused projects or Git centric projects. But GitHub's model actually really started out with social coding. And unfortunately, not a lot of people actually do the social aspect of GitHub. A lot of people will host their projects and that's about it. Or you'll talk internally to your team when you do have your first job. And that's the extent of it. But the thing is, GitHub it's a portfolio manager. A lot of people really focus on getting I focus a lot of my actual web side with my blog, and my portfolio side actually push most cover letters to my portfolio, which is GitHub. So I'm not sure if a lot of people are familiar, but on GitHub, you can actually pin your repositories on your main profile screen. That's something that not a lot of people actually take advantage of. A lot of people will just rely on whatever GitHub pins as their latest repositories, which isn't always the projects you're most proud of. So I recommend going through there and posting and pinning the portfolios that you're actually most proud of. And then you get a chance of looking at your contribution graph. My activity on GitHub actually has gotten a lot of notice from potential employers. And this is actually not as of late. This is actually 3 years ago when I was pretty active on GitHub. Still, I was able to get people to reach out to me directly, which I'll talk to in a minute. So bottom line, you just want to be social. Not a lot of people actually realize this, but there's a lot of open source projects on GitHub that you could take advantage of the fact that they're open source and the code's available to you, and the fact that the repos are there and the people who commit to them are there. Go and actually star and favorite projects on GitHub. Find projects that you use on in your programs today that are open source projects, and become a part of those communities. I found that when I joined with the Ruby community and the Rails community, I found it super easy to get in touch with other influential people in the community. One of the first things I did was actually go on Twitter, and I would ask how many people are on Twitter. Unfortunately, I'd probably find that most people don't use it actively, and that was one of the biggest things that got me into my first job, was actually Twitter. So follow more of the influential people on Twitter. Sam Saccone, he's on the Chrome team, and I think it does a couple other things out in the Google ecosphere. But he's really into open source, and he's pretty prominent in the community. He even has a blue check mark on Twitter, so that means he's a deal, I guess, or people know who he is. And he wrote this tweet a couple years ago about like how open source is supposed to be exciting, but you don't really get much feedback from it. All you get is people complaining about problems. So if you have a project you're really into and that you like and you appreciate, reach out to the maintainer directly and tell them how much you appreciate it. It could actually lead into a good intro to your first job. Same thing with Richard Seams. I actually sat down with Richard at one of my first conferences out in St. Augustine, which is Ancient City Ruby, just north of you guys. Sat down at breakfast at one of my first conferences and was able to meet this guy. And he's actually pretty prominent. He works for a company called Heroku. And though I didn't get my first job through him, I actually made a couple different connections through him who got me my first open source contribution. So one of his good friends that sat down at the table with us, he actually introduced me to him, who's a pretty prominent developer in New Zealand. And he's a big deal in the Ruby space. He was able to actually contribute to some of my projects as well. And it was from that connection I made at breakfast with this guy. And I also encourage you to actually contribute to open source too. A lot of people will shy away from open source because they don't feel like they have enough experience. But the thing is, the open source experience is actual real life experience. So a lot of resumes and cover letters will actually get picked out of the pile because of open source contributions, because it doesn't show, if you don't have any experience in actual real job or real projects, open source is a real project. So you're able to work with a team in an existing repository on bugs and issues and new features. And a lot of them are tagged. There's a lot of issues that are tagged for beginners. So if you feel like you are a beginner and you can't really approach a project, a lot of these people like Sam and Richard will actually mentor you into opening up your first pull request on a project. So highly recommend doing that. If you haven't done a pull request, I recommend either going to firstpullrequest.me, which is the site that we see here, and check in to see if you do have a pull request. And if you don't, I highly recommend following the prompts after that to get your first pull request. So check that out. It's a great way. I think if you get a pull request on a pretty well-known project, I think that stands out better than actual whatever degree or boot camp you've actually attended. It shows that you have commitment and you're able to work on an existing project and an existing team, which is always good. Also want to point out that Netlify CMS, the project I talked about earlier, is open source. So we do appreciate contributions. So if you guys want to check it out and check out some of the issues, a lot of them they're not labeled yet as beginner yet, but they're pretty approachable because it's a brand new project. We've actually started this project about 6 months ago. So most of the issues are approachable from all levels. And then finally, share your experience too. Like, talk about why you're here, which I did mention I was going to do a demo, but actually I already showed you guys my blog and how to write a blog post. So I'm going to skip right over that and talk about some of the blogs I've written. So at the moment, the demo that I would have showed you was learning computer science, which I've actually already published. So if you want to learn about how computer science works with Go, this was a really good intro post that I wrote and got a lot of great feedback from. I actually learned Go weeks prior to the job I have today and was able to interview in a language I didn't really know much about. But the fact that I actually wrote about it as I was learning it helped a lot of the concepts stick. And this is a thing that I was talking about earlier, which you can't really sail a ship while you're building it, which is why I highly recommend using something like the Netlify CMS or using something like even WordPress, something basic just to get your content out there and not focus on making it pretty. Well, focus on making it pretty, but don't focus on building it nonstop. Like, you've got to create the blog and start writing content for it. And that's really the goal. There's a site that we recommend. So if you wanted to try out Netlify CMS with no strings attached, if you click one of these deploy to Netlify buttons, it will actually launch and create a live blog for you where you can test and try out and see how it works. So definitely check this out. It's at templates.netlify.com. All you do is click one of those buttons and you can actually see what a blog looks like live. So definitely check that out. Also, I did mention too, all these slides are available at pizza.netlify.com. Netlify, you can create sites on Netlify. So you just get a little subname. If you don't have a custom domain, you can create one for you. And these slides, I've actually created them on their pizza.netlify.com. So definitely check that out. And also, when you're, I guess, surfing through some of these open source projects, you definitely should say hello. Even on Twitter, if you're not active in Twitter, I highly recommend get active on Twitter. I personally, I didn't apply to 255 jobs or 100 jobs or whatever the recommended amount of applications you put in. I applied to 3 jobs, and 2 other companies reached out to me directly from my blog to interview with them. So out of those 5 companies, I ended up getting 3 offers, and it was all from the I guess outreach I did with my blog, but also the outreach I did with Ruby Newbies and the outreach I did with open source. So I highly recommend you take the time to reach out to people and to say hello. And if you have, like, if you guys are learning Java, if you're learning PHP or whatever you're learning on the side, definitely get involved in those communities and find out who's influential, not necessarily to get you a job, but just to get an understanding of what the community is like. Because most of these community leaders are the people who are doing the hiring at the other companies. So it makes it a lot easier when you know somebody to get a job, because you don't have to go in the pile of the 250 applications. You could actually circumvent the pile and actually get the interview right away. And that's basically my experience into the industry, was actually doing that instead. So cool. So at this point, you've already validated yourself. You've learned how to code. You're writing code. So definitely keep up with that. Join community groups or create a community group. So if you guys, I am pretty confident there's actually some pretty good meetups in the Gainesville area, because there's actually a lot of companies that come out of there. I've been up there a couple times, so I don't know exactly which ones. I know there's a JavaScript one nearby, but definitely check those out, or make the drive up to Jacksonville or down to Orlando to give a meetup talk. So I definitely highly recommend that. That's another way how I got some pretty good exposure, is by doing meetup talks, which is part of the reason why I have the job I have today. It's because I did talks and I did meetups similar to this. As I mentioned, find out who the influential developers are and make friends with them, because most of the people who give them feedback are complaining about their projects and that they don't work. So if you don't complain and be friendly, it makes it so much easier to get to know other people. So, and most of the stuff I'm talking about, it's almost plain and simple, but it's just not a lot of people actually talk about it. And one other thing I do mention is check out CodeNewbie, codenewbies.org. It's an organization that's online. They meet every Wednesday night, so tomorrow, which is, I think, 5 p.m. your time. They do a Twitter chat, and they also do podcasts, and they're actually hosting a conference this year in 2 months up in New York, which is called it's called CodeLand, which is a newbie-focused code conference. So if you're looking to get a job and you want to work in New York, I think it might be a really good opportunity to go there. So, and then finally, my last point is just back up your experience with examples. So if there's something you learn or something that you wish there was a blog post, a lot of the blogs I wrote were based on stuff that I found that I couldn't find before. I would just write a blog post if I couldn't Google for an answer. Do that, and make sure you're an expert about your own experience. So being an expert makes it easier when you're in an interview. Most of the people ask you like who you are, where you're from, or why are you doing this? And usually when you write about your experience, those answers are super easy to answer. And all you have to focus about is doing whiteboarding and actual learning how to code. Just a quick example. I learned React Native, which is a way to write JavaScript write JavaScript code to make iOS and Android apps. I got into this like maybe 6 months after it came out. I wrote quite a few blog posts about this, and I was pretty consistent about writing blog posts about this at a time when not really much content was out there on this subject. And because of that, it got me an opportunity to speak at a conference here in San Francisco. And then because of that, I was on a podcast about React Native. And because of that, I got tons of LinkedIn requests and recruiters reaching out to me to work for their companies to actually do React Native. I also, someone reached out to do a book deal. They wanted me to write a book about the subject. I actually declined because writing is not, I have a finance background. I'm in the math. I'm not really in the writing as much. I could write blog posts, but I don't think I really wanted to write a book. But that opportunity came. And at the company I worked at the time, I was able to create a React Native app, an iOS app, with having very little experience in iOS at the time, and had about maybe a couple months of doing some Swift code and doing JavaScript React Native apps. But I was able to do this and actually catch the eye of my current employer to give me more opportunities within the company. So always look for something new to do, always continue to grow, and don't be stagnant. So that's basically my talk in a nutshell. I highly recommend everybody check out the slides if you want to catch up with some of those links. And if you have any questions, Duncan, let me know.
Okay, thanks, Brian. Anybody got questions?
How did he find the time? Did he set a schedule to write the blog post?
Did you set a schedule to write your blog posts when you do them?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in the very beginning, I made sure I wrote at least 3 blog posts a week. And I was pretty consistent. Every week I would write 3 blog posts. And I also want to mention too, most of my blog posts are less than 500 words. So it's a lot of screenshots. It's like links to other things. If I find some documentation that I found, like a really cool Git command that no one ever talks about, I'll write like maybe a 100-word blog post, like tweet form, 140 characters that could fit into a tweet. Sometimes my blog post would be that long. But to answer your original question, at first I was 3 times a week. At the moment, I am writing about once every other week, but trying to stay consistent on that.
So Brian, so my question is, given that most everybody in here probably is intimidated about writing or speaking, what expert level do you have to be, or does it even matter?
So it really is the latter. It doesn't really matter because most people who are looking for answers are beginners. So if you're a beginner and you're writing to other beginners to respond, like basically if you've learned something that you wish that you would have known yesterday, those are the best blog posts. Those are the ones that get the most hits because most people who are learning how to code are going to look for that content. So I would say start today. Don't wait until you're an expert on something. A lot of the blog posts I wrote about React Native was when I didn't know anything and I ended up figuring it out. I would just write a blog post about it. So that way other people can benefit from the struggle that I went through.
Awesome. Anybody got any questions?
What are some of the dynamics you look for in like the offers that you get for jobs?
Yeah. So so in Florida it was quite different. I guess this is my third programming job since I made the career switch. When I actually started working in Orlando at a company called IZEA. And at first my dynamic was basically making sure I didn't make less money than I made when I was in sales. I know it's pretty simple. The other dynamics was basically making sure there was smarter people in the room on the team than myself. So a lot of times your first job will be to be the first developer or the first programmer for some side project that someone's trying to get funded, or those are appealing to some people, but not as appealing to me because I made a career change in my late 20s when I was already married with a family. So that wasn't as appealing. So I wanted to make sure that I had like the benefits to back it up with. As of today, in the Bay Area, there's a lot of opportunity out here. So there's every day you can find a different company to work for if you really wanted to. I tend to look for companies that allow freedom. So freedom of schedule. I don't work 9 to 5. I actually work. I work on projects, and when the project's done, I get free time in between projects. So I tend to work from home a lot. I like that sort of freedom, and the flexibility of schedule is what I like a lot, especially since I have a family. I'm not sure if I answered your original question now.
No, that answers my question. What, if you don't mind me asking, what made you change from job to job?
People reaching out to me directly. Again, I've actually never applied to a job as of yet. So because of my work, speaking at conferences and meetups and writing blog posts, people reach out to me. I just got people reach out to me just yesterday about a job here in the Bay Area, and I most of the time I decline. But when an opportunity comes that's better than the opportunity I have now, I tend to listen. And so this is my second job in the Bay Area. I worked one company in Florida, so it's my third company in 4 years. Basically, I was just looking for somewhere where I could grow, and I wasn't the smartest person in the room. So as the latest company I have, I'm paired with a lot of people who have been in the industry for 10 to 15, 20 years. And that work on languages that I haven't had the opportunity to work with yet. So it's an opportunity for me to continue to grow and not be stagnant. So that's basically the reasons why I've left the previous company. And it wasn't at a time that I was actually looking for something different. It just happened to come across me.
Okay. Anyone else?
What was your most challenging part of being a self-taught developer?
I think the most challenging is never knowing when you know something. I think that's probably the hardest thing. Like, there's a lot of things that you can't know everything. So I've basically accepted that early on, though it did take me a while to actually realize that. But knowing that good is sometimes is enough, that you don't have to be great, because most developers are actually just okay. And once I realized that, it made it a lot easier for me to learn on my own. For sure. So most developers, even some of the best developers that are out here in the Bay, they're not running large companies. We're just okay developers that focus on one problem that got pretty good at it.
Is that part of the imposter syndrome?
Yeah, it falls within the imposter syndrome, which technically could be a myth. Some people don't really like that term, but it's definitely, I think it's a real thing. It doesn't just apply to coding; it applies to all of life. You always think somebody thinks something different, when in reality, most of us are just the same.
Well, following up on that, how do you deal with situations where you've been given a project that feels way above you?
That's a good question. That's actually happened quite a few times in my career too. Like my first job out in the Bay Area, I learned Angular. I actually got a job to write Angular code, but I had never touched any front end JavaScript or front end code at the time. And I ended up just taking the first weekend I got in the Bay Area. I actually took a course in person. You could do the same thing online, really. But it's just knowing when to ask help. Sometimes we tend to struggle on a problem for too long. My rule of thumb is if I struggle for 30 minutes or longer, I start reaching out for help. So whether if it's internally to the company I work for, asking a senior developer or another developer who's seen the problem, what their opinion is. A lot of times you can get unstuck really quickly if you just ask for help. I also use my network too on Twitter. So I keep pushing back to Twitter too, because a lot of developers are on Twitter and a lot of developers are out there ready to help you. So I actually have asked a ton of questions on Twitter, just like, hey, has anybody ever seen this problem? Or write a Stack Overflow question and then tweet it. And I usually get a response really quickly. And I've learned if I ask questions quickly, like obviously don't ask for the question after looking at it for 2 seconds. But if you get stuck on a problem, maybe for an hour or a half a day, whatever it happens to be, when you realize you should probably ask for help, ask for help publicly. And I guess don't be afraid to admit defeat too, as well. So if the problem is just not obtainable with your current knowledge, be okay with saying that this is not a problem that you can approach, or possibly that you need more time to actually research more into the problem. So if you have to learn the framework that you're touching, or learn the language, or learn the algorithm to actually complete the code, then sometimes you have to take the time out and do a little bit of learning.
Awesome. Anybody else? No? Well, thanks very much, Brian. We appreciate you taking the time and the presentation. A lot of valuable information. We appreciate it.
Cool. And my information's on the screen, so definitely reach out on Twitter. That's my Twitter handle, as well as my email as well. So I tend to ask. I do a bit of mentoring the bootcamp students out here in the Bay Area. So any questions, like, not off limits. I've answered questions in SQL Server, which I've never seen or touched. I've answered tons of questions about things I've never actually seen. So feel free to send me an email if anybody has any questions, just general about career or just about code.
Okay. Thank you very much.
All right, guys. Have a good evening.
All right.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Thank you.